January 1943. Eastern Front, Soviet Union. The snow had fallen all night, burying the world beneath a white silence that felt heavier than sound. Dawn arrived without color, a pale gray light creeping across the frozen fields like a reluctant witness. Second Lieutenant Daniel Kraus stood at the edge of the airfield, his breath turning into thin clouds that vanished as quickly as his thoughts. The war had taught him many things, but patience was not one of them. The engines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 coughed awake behind him, their growl cutting through the stillness. Ground crews moved like shadows, bundled in thick coats, faces hidden, hands raw and red from the cold. Every movement was practiced, precise. There was no room for mistakes anymore. Not here. Not now. Daniel pulled his gloves tighter and glanced at the sky. It looked calm, too calm. He had learned to distrust days like this. Clear skies meant visibility, and visibility meant death came faster. Orders just came in, Sergeant Weber said, approaching him with a folded map. Soviet bombers spotted moving west. Escort mission. High altitude. Daniel nodded without speaking. Escort missions were supposed to be simple. Fly high. Stay close. Keep the enemy fighters away. But nothing in this war was ever simple. He unfolded the map and studied the red lines drawn across it, paths carved by men who would never fly them themselves. As he walked toward his aircraft, the familiar smell of oil and metal wrapped around him like a second skin. The Bf 109 had scars along its fuselage, small bullet marks repaired poorly in the field. It had survived longer than many pilots, longer than some of his friends. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat as if it were part of his body. The canopy closed with a solid click, sealing him inside his own narrow world. Instruments flickered to life. He ran through the checklist automatically, his mind drifting despite his best efforts. Berlin felt like another lifetime away. His mother's last letter was folded carefully in his jacket pocket. She wrote about ration lines, about broken windows, about hope spoken in whispers. She never mentioned fear, but Daniel could read it between every line. Blue flight, prepare for takeoff, came the voice over the radio. The engines roared louder. Snow blew backward as the aircraft began to roll. Daniel pushed the throttle forward, and the world surged beneath him. The ground fell away, and suddenly he was free, rising into a sky that cared nothing for uniforms or flags. At 6,000 meters, the cold was brutal. Frost crept along the edges of the canopy. The Soviet landscape stretched endlessly below, forests dark as ink, rivers frozen solid, villages reduced to black dots in a white sea. Somewhere down there, men were fighting and dying with rifles and shovels. Up here, death came at the speed of sound. Contact, 12 o'clock. A voice crackled in his headset. Dark shapes moved against the sky. PE-2 bombers, slow and heavy, crawling forward like wounded beasts. The German fighters tightened formation, sliding into position above and behind them. For a moment, everything held still. Then the sky broke open. Tracer rounds stitched the air, glowing lines ripping through the silence. Soviet Yak fighters burst from the clouds, fast and aggressive. The radio exploded with shouted warnings and half-finished sentences. Daniel banked hard to the left, his aircraft shuddering under the strain. A Yak flashed past him, close enough for him to see the pilot's face. Young, terrified, determined. Daniel squeezed the trigger. His machine guns barked, and the sky filled with fire. The Yak spiraled downward, smoke trailing behind it. There was no time to think. Another fighter was already on his tail. Alarm screamed in his cockpit as bullets punched through metal. The aircraft lurched violently. Daniel gritted his teeth and pulled the stick back, climbing sharply. The engine screamed in protest. Blue 2 is hit. I'm losing altitude. The voice cut out mid-sentence. Daniel's hands shook, but his movements stayed precise. Training took over where fear tried to settle. He dove through the chaos, firing in short bursts, forcing an enemy fighter away from one of the bombers. The air was crowded with spinning machines, falling debris, and men screaming into the void. Then impact. A violent jolt slammed through his plane. Warning lights flared red. Smoke filled the cockpit, burning his eyes and throat. The engine sputtered, coughed, and began to die. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered, fighting the controls. The altimeter dropped rapidly. Below him, enemy territory stretched wide and unforgiving. There would be no friendly faces waiting there. No rescue. The engine gave one final shudder and fell silent. The sudden quiet was terrifying. Daniel stared at the frozen land rushing up to meet him. His heart hammered against his ribs. He reached for the canopy release, his fingers numb and clumsy. At the last moment, he ejected. The world spun violently as the parachute snapped open above him. Pain exploded through his body, but he was alive. Below, his aircraft struck the ground in a burst of flame, sending black smoke curling into the pale sky. As he drifted downward, the battle continued above him, indifferent to his fall. The noise faded, replaced by the whisper of wind and the distant crack of gunfire. Daniel hit the ground hard, rolling through deep snow. For several seconds, he couldn't move. Then the cold seeped in, sharp and merciless. He pushed himself up slowly, breath ragged, every muscle screaming. He was alone, injured, behind enemy lines. In the distance, he heard voices, Russian. Daniel pulled his pistol from its holster and scanned the white horizon. The war, it seemed, was far from finished with him. And this was only the beginning. The cold came first. It crept into Daniel Kraus's bones like a living thing, wrapping itself around his limbs and tightening its grip with every passing second. Snow soaked through his flight suit as he lay half-buried where he had fallen, the white ground swallowing the last traces of the sky battle above. Smoke still curled faintly on the horizon, what remained of his aircraft, burning its final mark into the frozen land. Daniel forced himself to move. Pain shot through his left leg as he tried to stand. He bit down hard, refusing to cry out. The training manuals had warned about this moment, the seconds after survival, when the body wanted to collapse and the mind wanted to surrender. He would do neither. Voices echoed again. Closer now. Russian. He stumbled toward a shallow tree line, each step a quiet battle against dizziness and pain. His breath sounded too loud in his ears. He pulled his parachute cords free and dragged the fabric into the snow, burying it beneath branches and ice. Any sign left behind could be a death sentence. The forest offered little protection. Bare trees stood like skeletons, their branches clawing at the gray sky. The wind cut through them unhindered, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery. The front line was not far. That was both good and very bad. Daniel checked his pistol. 3 magazines left. Not much. He had no food, no radio, and no map beyond the memory of a folded piece of paper now lost with his aircraft. He was deep in enemy territory, wounded, and dressed in a uniform that made him a target to every man within miles. A sharp crack echoed behind him. "Stoy," a voice shouted. Daniel froze. Boots crunched through the snow. Shapes moved between the trees. Red Army soldiers, 3 of them, rifles raised, eyes locked on him. Their faces were hard, weathered, younger than he expected. One of them had blood dried on his sleeve. Another trembled slightly, whether from cold or fear, Daniel could not tell. Slowly, carefully, Daniel raised his hands. The soldiers approached, surrounding him in a practiced motion. One kicked his pistol away before Daniel could even think of reaching for it. Another tore the iron cross from his collar, spitting into the snow. They spoke rapidly among themselves, words sharp and angry. Daniel understood none of it, but the tone was clear enough. One of them struck him with the butt of his rifle. The world tilted. Snow rushed up to meet his face. When Daniel woke, the light was gone. A dim oil lamp flickered above him, casting long shadows across wooden walls. The air smelled of smoke, damp clothing, and unwashed bodies. His head throbbed with every heartbeat. He tried to move and found his hands bound tightly in front of him. A hut. A Soviet forward outpost, most likely. Across the room, men sat at a rough table, eating from metal bowls. No one spoke. Their silence felt heavier than shouting. A single guard stood near the door, watching Daniel with tired eyes and a finger resting near the trigger of his rifle. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost its meaning. Eventually, the door opened. An officer entered, taller than the others, his coat cleaner, his movements controlled. He removed his gloves slowly and studied Daniel as one might examine a damaged tool. "You are Luftwaffe," he said in broken German. Daniel said nothing. The officer nodded, as if he expected that. "Pilot." Still silence. The officer pulled a chair closer and sat, leaning forward. "Your name?" Daniel met his gaze. "Lieutenant," he said finally. Not a lie, but not the whole truth. The officer smiled faintly. "You lie badly." He stood and gestured. Two soldiers grabbed Daniel, dragging him upright. Pain exploded through his leg again. Daniel gasped despite himself. The officer's expression hardened. "You will talk," he said calmly. "Everyone does." The march began before dawn. Daniel was pushed into the snow, along with a group of other prisoners, German infantrymen captured in recent fighting. Some were barely older than boys. Others looked ancient despite their age, eyes hollow, faces gray. They walked east. Villages passed in silence. Burned houses, shattered churches, frozen wells stained dark beneath the ice. Civilians watched from doorways and broken windows. Some stared with hatred, others with nothing at all. Daniel stumbled more than once. Each time, a rifle, but reminded him to keep moving. By the second day, hunger gnawed at him worse than the cold. They were given thin soup and black bread, just enough to stay alive. Men whispered at night about camps, about Siberia, about never seeing home again. Daniel listened, but said little. His thoughts drifted constantly to the sky, to the freedom he had taken for granted, to the engine's roar, the sense of control. Down here, he was nothing more than a body being moved from one place to another. On the third night, they stopped near a ruined factory. Guards rotated, stamping their feet to keep warm. Snow began to fall again, soft and endless. That was when Daniel noticed him. A prisoner a few places down the line, taller, broader, with a scar cutting across his cheek. He met Daniel's eyes briefly and nodded, just once. Later, as darkness thickened, the man whispered in careful German, "You fly?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "So did I," the man said. "Before the war ended me." "What's your name?" Daniel asked quietly. "Erik," he replied. "And you?" "Daniel." Erik glanced toward the guards. "We won't survive the camp," he said flatly. "Not winter. Not this one." Daniel swallowed. "Then what?" Erik's eyes flicked toward the forest, beyond the ruins. "Then we don't go." A gunshot echoed somewhere far away. The guards cursed and shifted position. For the first time since he fell from the sky, something stirred inside Daniel. Not hope, not yet, but the faint outline of possibility. Escape. Dangerous. Unlikely. Almost impossible. But war had taught him one thing above all else. Impossible did not mean undone. Snow continued to fall, covering tracks, swallowing sound. And in the darkness, two prisoners began to plan their defiance of a war that refused to let them live. The cold came first. It crept into Daniel Kraus's bones like a living thing, wrapping itself around his limbs and tightening its grip with every passing second. Snow soaked through his flight suit as he lay half-buried where he had fallen, the white ground swallowing the last traces of the sky battle above. Smoke still curled faintly on the horizon, what remained of his aircraft, burning its final mark into the frozen land. Daniel forced himself to move. Pain shot through his left leg as he tried to stand. He bit down hard, refusing to cry out. The training manuals had warned about this moment, the seconds after survival, when the body wanted to collapse and the mind wanted to surrender. He would do neither. Voices echoed again. Closer now. Russian. He stumbled toward a shallow tree line, each step a quiet battle against dizziness and pain. His breath sounded too loud in his ears. He pulled his parachute cords free and dragged the fabric into the snow, burying it beneath branches and ice. Any sign left behind could be a death sentence. The forest offered little protection. Bare trees stood like skeletons, their branches clawing at the gray sky. The wind cut through them unhindered, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery. The front line was not far. That was both good and very bad. The snow covered everything. It fell in thick, soundless sheets, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. The ruined factory loomed behind the prisoners like a broken monument, its shattered windows staring blindly into the night. Guards moved slowly now, shoulders hunched, rifles slung low, exhaustion dulling their vigilance. Daniel Kraus lay still, his breath shallow, his hands numb inside thin gloves. Every instinct in his body screamed for movement, for flight, but experience had taught him that patience was its own kind of courage. Beside him, Erik waited. Minutes stretched into eternity. Somewhere in the darkness, a guard coughed. Another cursed the cold. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke and metal. Then Erik moved. It was subtle, barely more than a shadow slipping free of its place in the line. Daniel followed a heartbeat later. They rolled silently into a shallow depression beside the factory wall, pressing themselves into the snow as footsteps passed only meters away. A searchlight swept across the yard. They did not breathe. When the light moved on, Erik gestured toward the forest. Now, they ran. Not fast, never fast. Speed drew attention. Instead, they moved with deliberate urgency, keeping low, using the ruined buildings for cover until the trees swallowed them whole. Branches tore at Daniel's clothes, reopening wounds, but he did not slow. Pain was irrelevant. Capture was not. The forest was alive with sound, the creak of frozen trees, the crunch of snow beneath boots, the distant thunder of artillery. Somewhere behind them, a shout rang out. Stop. A flare ignited the sky in harsh white light. Daniel and Erik dropped instantly, pressing themselves into the earth as bullets snapped through branches above their heads. Snow sprayed their faces. Daniel felt his heart pounding, so hard it seemed impossible the sound could be contained within his chest. They crawled, slowly, methodically. The flare burned out, plunging the world back into darkness. Shouts echoed again, confused now. Dogs barked somewhere far to the south. Erik leaned close. River, he whispered. If we reach water, they'll lose us. Daniel nodded, though his lungs burned and his legs screamed with every movement. They moved for hours. Time dissolved into breath and motion. At some point, Daniel stopped feeling his fingers. At another, he realized he could no longer feel his feet at all. Fear tried to take root, not of death, but of sleep. He forced himself onward, counting steps, whispering numbers under his breath. At last, they heard it. The river was wide and partially frozen, dark water sliding silently beneath cracked ice. Mist hung low above its surface, a ghostly veil that hid the far bank. Erik did not hesitate. He stepped onto the ice, testing it with care. It groaned but held. Daniel followed. Halfway across, the ice cracked. Daniel froze. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. He lowered himself onto his stomach, spreading his weight as he inched forward. The cold radiated up through the ice, a numbing, merciless force. They reached the far bank just as shouts erupted again behind them. Shots rang out. Bullets struck the ice, sending shards flying. Daniel and Erik plunged into the trees and did not stop running until their bodies could give no more. Dawn found them in a hollow beneath tangled roots, hidden from sight and wind alike. Daniel shook uncontrollably, his teeth chattering violently. Erik tore strips from his own shirt, wrapping Daniel's leg as tightly as he could. "You'll lose it if we don't warm you," Erik said grimly. Daniel tried to speak, but his lips barely moved. Erik pulled him close, pressing their bodies together, sharing what little heat remained. It was humiliating, necessary, human. Hours passed. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, it revealed a world untouched by mercy. Endless forest. No roads. No villages. No sign of friendly lines. Daniel laughed weakly. "We escaped," he said. "Now what?" Erik did not smile. "Now we survive." They moved only when necessary. They drank melted snow, ate bark, and whatever frozen berries Erik could identify. Once they snared a rabbit. They ate it raw, hands shaking, barely tasting the blood. On the fourth day, they found a cabin. It was abandoned, or seemed to be. The door hung open, one hinge broken. Inside, they found an iron stove, empty shelves, and a single blanket stiff with age. Erik managed to start a fire using scraps of wood and a stolen match. The warmth was intoxicating. Daniel slept. He dreamed of flying. The sound of voices woke him. Erik was already on his feet, knife in hand. The voices were close, Russian, calm, not shouting. Daniel crawled toward the window and peeked through a crack in the wall. Two men stood outside. They were not soldiers. Their clothes were worn, civilian. One carried an axe, the other a sack of grain. Erik exhaled slowly. Civilians, he whispered. That doesn't mean safe. The door creaked open. An old man entered, followed by a younger woman. They froze when they saw the prisoners. Fear flashed across their faces, then something else, calculation. No one spoke. Finally, the old man raised his hand slowly. Niet soldier, he said carefully. Farmer. Erik lowered his knife, just slightly. The woman glanced at Daniel's leg, then at the blood-stained bandage. She said something sharp to the old man, her voice urgent. He nodded. They left without another word. Daniel's heart pounded. They'll report us. Or they'll help, Erik said quietly. Sometimes people are more than the war. That night, the woman returned alone. She brought bread, and a choice that would change everything. The woman did not speak when she entered the cabin. She placed the bread on the table between them, dark, heavy, still warm, and stepped back. Her eyes moved from Erik's knife to Daniel's wounded leg, then to the fire. She understood more than words could explain. My name is Anya, she said at last, her German slow but careful. You cannot stay. Erik nodded. We know. Anya hesitated, then added, but I will help. One night only. She gestured for them to eat. Daniel broke the bread with shaking hands. It tasted like life, like home. He felt shame for how quickly he devoured it. Anya watched without judgment. There are patrols, she continued. Roads. Dogs. She traced lines on the table with her finger. This forest is not safe. Erik leaned forward. Where is safe? Anya's mouth tightened. Nowhere. Still she stayed. She cleaned Daniel's wound with boiled water, her hands steady, practiced. The pain was blinding, but Daniel did not cry out. When she finished, she wrapped his leg tightly with a clean strip torn from her own coat. You fly, she said suddenly, meeting his eyes. Daniel froze. How do you know? She glanced at his jacket. Your hands. And how you look at the sky. For a moment, something softened in her expression. Then it vanished. My brother flew, she said. Red Air Force. He died near Kiev. Silence filled the cabin. I am sorry, Daniel said quietly. She nodded once, accepting the words without forgiveness. That night, they slept in shifts. At dawn, Anya returned with a cart. Hidden beneath sacks of potatoes and frozen hay, Daniel felt every bump in the road like a hammer blow to his leg. Erik walked beside the cart, playing the role of a silent laborer. Head down, shoulders slumped. They reached a village by midday. German trucks stood in the square. Daniel's heart sank. Wehrmacht soldiers laughed near a fire, smoking, their boots clean, their faces relaxed. Occupation had settled here like a disease that pretended to be order. Anya did not slow. She greeted the soldiers politely, offering papers, complaining loudly about the cold and poor harvest. One of the soldiers glanced at the cart, poked a sack with his rifle, then waved her through. Daniel did not breathe until they were gone. Beyond the village, Anya turned onto a narrow path leading into dense woods. This is where I leave you, she said. Erik frowned. You said you would help. I did, she replied sharply. This is help. She handed Erik a small bundle, dried meat, matches, a crude compass. Then she looked at Daniel. If you are caught again, she said, you will die. Daniel met her gaze. Why help us at all? Anya's jaw tightened. Because war already took enough from me. She turned the cart around and left without looking back. They traveled by night and hid by day. Daniel's fever came and went, each wave worse than the last. Erik carried him when he could, dragging him when he could not. Once, Erik collapsed beside him, chest heaving, eyes empty. "Leave me," Daniel whispered. Erik laughed bitterly. "Not my way." On the 7th day, they reached the rail line. It was heavily guarded. Trains thundered past, carrying tanks, supplies, men. The war moved on iron and steam, indifferent to the bodies beneath its wheels. "We need papers," Erik said, "or a miracle." They got neither. Instead, they got a knock on the back of the head. Daniel woke in a cellar. The smell of damp earth and mold filled his lungs. His hands were bound again, but differently. Looser, rough rope instead of wire. Erik sat across from him, blood dried along his temple. A man stood between them, wearing civilian clothes and a red scarf. "You were careless," the man said in perfect German. Daniel stared. "Who are you?" The man smiled without warmth. "Someone who hates the Germans more than he hates you." He crouched down eye level. "You were seen. Reported. But not to the army." Erik leaned forward. "Partisans." The man nodded. "Yes." Relief and fear collided in Daniel's chest. "You can help us," the partisan continued. "Or you can die. The choice is simple." Daniel swallowed. "Help how?" The man stood. "You fly planes. You understand engines. Trains." Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle on him. "Sabotage." "Yes." Outside, an explosion thundered in the distance. The war had found them again. Only now it was asking them to choose a side. The train did not slow. It thundered through the forest like a living thing, iron wheels screaming against frozen rails, steam pouring into the night air. Daniel Kraus lay hidden beneath the embankment, the cold earth pressed against his chest, his heart beating in time with the machine above him. 30 meters. That was all the space he had. The partisans had explained the plan in short, efficient sentences. Place the charge. Set the timer. Run. Simple words. Terrible consequences. Daniel's hands shook as he checked the detonator. He had repaired engines in midair, guided damaged aircraft home through fire and smoke. But this was different. In the sky, danger was honest. Here it was intimate. Erik lay beside him, eyes fixed on the tracks. "If this fails," Erik whispered, "don't look back." Daniel nodded. "I won't." The train roared overhead, loaded with tanks, fuel, men. Enough steel and fire to kill thousands. Daniel crawled forward, every movement measured, every breath controlled. He fixed the explosive beneath the rail with numb fingers, the metal biting into his skin. The timer clicked into place. 10 minutes. They ran. The explosion tore the night apart. Rails twisted like paper. Carriages derailed, crashing into one another in a storm of metal and fire. The forest lit up as fuel ignited, flames climbing into the sky. Screams followed, confused, panicked, human. Daniel and Erik watched from the treeline, faces illuminated by the burning wreckage. "It's done," Erik said. But the war was never finished. Gunfire erupted behind them. German patrols poured into the clearing, shouting orders, firing blindly into the trees. The partisans scattered. Chaos swallowed the moment. Erik shoved Daniel hard. "Go." Daniel ran, his wounded legs screaming, lungs burning. He heard Erik firing behind him, short, controlled bursts. Then a shout. Then silence. Daniel turned. Erik stood in the open, weapon empty, surrounded. A German officer raised his pistol. Their eyes met across the clearing. Erik smiled. The shot echoed once. Daniel did not stop running. 3 weeks later, Daniel crossed the front line. He barely remembered how. Only fragments remained, Russian uniforms, whispered directions, the sound of artillery growing closer. A Red Army patrol found him collapsed in the snow, delirious, barely alive. This time, they did not raise their rifles. Daniel survived the war. The doctors said his leg would never fully heal. He would never fly again. The sky, once his home, was now something to be watched from the ground. In 1961, he returned to the forest. The tracks were gone. The scars were not. He stood where the train had burned and placed a small wooden marker in the earth. No name, no flag, just a date. January 1943. He looked up at the sky, wide, endless, unchanged. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, he spoke. We ran. The wind carried the words away. Epilogue. War took Daniel's wings, but it gave him something else, a truth he carried for the rest of his life. Freedom is not always found in the sky. Sometimes it lives in the choices we make on the ground.